Hey plant lovers, and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to talk to you about something that I really wish somebody would have talked to me about back in 2021, 2022, when I faced this issue and experienced a huge heartbreak. This was at the beginning phases of my Anthurium craze, and I had a wish list plant that I waited for, saved up for, purchased, and was severely disappointed when it did not look like what it was supposed to look like. So today's topic is clones versus selves. So let's take this beautiful plant here. This is my RG Dressleri by Carla Blackier Amanda, and it is one of my favorite plants in my collection. It's got beautiful color, a beautiful shape and texture, and let's say you're watching this video and you absolutely fall in love with the features of this plant. There are two ways you could get your hands on a version of this. You might notice the beautiful flower that it's produced for me, and honestly, you guys, it smells really sweet and fragrant right now. Let me bring it up a little bit closer so that you can take a look and fully enjoy. So if I were to pollinate this plant with pollen collected from the last flower, that would be self-pollination. And if it were successful, this whole flower here would turn into a fruit or infructescence. And after a few weeks to months of waiting, I would harvest those berries, pop out the little seeds, grow them into tiny little plant babies, and sell them off. And you might be super excited to get a plant that this mother yielded. And you would rightfully be excited because I think this plant would produce beautiful offspring no matter what. But here is where I lacked information back in 2022. When you self-pollinate a plant, any offspring that it produces will not be the exact same as the mother plant. I know that almost doesn't make sense. For one, we as people have to take a jump into understanding sexual reproduction that can happen with a self-pollination, because obviously there is no way that any human being could get themselves pregnant. In humans, in animals, it takes two, a male and a female. In plants, however, that's not always the case. Although there is a male phase and a female phase for each flower, you can successfully pollinate a flower in female phase with pollen that you collected from the same exact plant. The babies then would have this plant as the mother and this plant as the father. So that's the first jump we have to make in our minds to be able to understand how that can work in the plant world. It's so different from how things work in our world. And it's easy to think or to assume that since this plant here would be both mother and father, that all the babies would look exactly like this. It kind of makes sense, right? However, that's actually not the way it works. Inside the genes of each plant is an encyclopedia of data, just like with people, just like with animals. And there are generations to consider here. The parents that made this plant had parents too. The parents of those plants had parents too. And so buried within the cellular data of every plant are so many different characteristics and traits that maybe did not present themselves as dominant and maybe did not appear in the genetic makeup of this plant that we can see, but they're still there. Therefore, when this plant produces offspring via sexual reproduction, that is pollen from a male flower onto a female flower, all of that DNA and all of those hidden traits will be unlocked. They're kind of like put in a blender and mixed up, and just divvied out among those seedlings, and you don't always know what you're gonna get. Now, just like what you probably learned in biology class, there are dominant traits and there are recessive traits. And the dominant ones are the most likely to present themselves. And so when you do produce seedlings via self-pollination of this plant, they may look all similar and they may look a lot like this mother. Every now and then, you'll get a seedling which has recessive traits that present, and it looks totally weird and totally unexpected, and we'll get into that a little bit later in the video. But essentially, if I were to create hundreds of seedlings from this exact plant using the sexual reproduction method by pollinating this flower, you would never get something that was exactly like this. Because even though plants are just plants, they're still unique too, genetically. And there's no identical offspring and mother. There's just not. So that's one way you could obtain a version of this plant. However, if you fell in love with these exact traits and you couldn't settle for something similar, you wanted something identical, I have good news for you. That's also possible with plants. And that's why I think plants are just so cool. Because if I were to take a cutting of this plant, a stem section with a growth point that later activated and grew a smaller plant, it would be an identical genetic copy of this. And that's actually how I acquired this plant. This plant is not original to me. I saw it online somewhere. Somebody had a beautiful, beautiful plant and I wanted the exact thing. So I inquired to ask if they had any clones. Clone is a word you'll want to remember if you're getting into Anthurium and you don't want to be duped. If you ask for a clone of a plant, that means what you want is a cutting, propagation, division. These are all words used interchangeably that essentially mean you would get this exact thing, just smaller because it would have been freshly grown from a stem cutting. Now, often clones of anything are more expensive than a seedling produced via self-pollination because your seller knows that the mother plant has the traits you love, and also it is much slower to produce plants via clones than you were to do a whole entire batch. If I were to pollinate this, I might get 100 seedlings. It would take me maybe 6 months from start to finish, from the day of pollination to the day they're ready to go out. But after 6 months, I'd have 100 of them. If I were to slowly start taking cuttings of this plant, I think safely I could probably take 2 or 3 over the next 6 months. And that's still kind of risking the health of the overall mother plant. So creating plants via stem cutting or cloning is a lot slower as well. That's another reason why clones will be more expensive than self-seedlings. Neither one are bad. Neither one is the right way to acquire an Anthurium. But I want to educate the audience because this was something I did not know when I first started the hobby. I'd like to tell you a story now about the heartbreak I experienced when I tried to purchase Anthurium King of Clarinervium. So towards the beginning of my hobby, I was watching YouTube, and I think it was a super old Kaylee Ellen Anthurium haul video, and she hauled a plant called King of Clarinervium. She speculated that it was some kind of Clarinervium hybrid, and you guys, if you've seen it, you know it is a beautiful plant, the King of Clarinervium. So in my innocence, I added King of Clarinervium to a wish list and I went about my life. Maybe a year or so later, I was scrolling through Instagram and I saw available a King of Clarinervium seedling from Cartel Dawn, which I respect them as a seller. I have many, many plants from them, but I think their practices have changed. Back then, this was closer to 2022, they were advertising that they had available King of Clarinervium as a seedling. And I was new to the hobby. I didn't think to ask. I assumed that if they were marketing King of Clarinervium, it was King of Clarinervium. So I splurged. It was a $200 plant, which at the time was one of the more pricey things I'd ever purchased as far as the plant hobby goes. And it came in, and I was a little bit disappointed by the plant. It did not handle import well, which is not the fault of the seller, and it's not really the fault of who the plant was, but it didn't handle import well, and it unfortunately died after that. I was so heartbroken that I had lost the $200. I was very wary of buying another King of Clarinervium because I didn't want it to die again. Like I said, I was still kind of new to Anthurium. In my period of waiting to build up the nerve to import another one, I learned this important lesson that I just explained about self versus clone. And after doing a little bit more digging, learned that all of those King of Clarinervium seedlings that Cartel Dawn was offering at the time, they were all self-pollinated seedlings. They weren't clones. They weren't cuttings. And I'm not saying that this was a deceptive practice or false advertising by any means, because they didn't claim to be clones. They just said, here's King of Clarinervium for sale. Now, in my defense, I thought if it had the name King Clarinervium, that's what it was. In their defense, they did title it King of Clarinervium seedling. And to those who are a little bit more well-versed in Anthurium terminology, they would know right away, okay, this was produced via pollination. It's not a clone. But for me, and unfortunately many others, we were a little bit disappointed as we learned that the plant we had kind of splurged on, that wish list item, whether it died, as in my case, or whether it went on to grow, as in the case of others, was not what we wanted. It was not what we thought it was. And you may be watching this and have a similar experience to share. And I want to say again, I am not dogging Cartel Dawn. I don't think they really did anything wrong. I think that if they wanted to take an extra step, they could have clarified that these were self-seedlings, and they have made this change recently. If you were to go on their website now and type in King of Clarinervium, the only results you would get would say King of Clarinervium X self, which means that their King of Clarinervium mother plant was self-pollinated. And I'm so grateful that they have changed this practice and that they are now being completely clear about what these seedlings are. But back then, I didn't know better and I didn't know to ask. I was so disappointed that after spending the money on a wish list plant, which came in and then died, that it wasn't even the plant I wanted anyways. And that if I would have known better, I never would have bought that seedling. I would have waited and waited until a clone became available. I know, it's enough to make you cry, right? Anyways, after learning this, I determined I would be okay with a self-seedling as long as it turned out really close to the original. So I put some feelers out there. I inquired a few places to see if they had any, and somebody told me that they had the original King of Clarinervium. They had obtained a clone from, it was probably Indonesia, I think, is where this plant originated. They had a clone, it had grown to maturity by now, and they had already taken cuttings of it, and that those cuttings would be available soon. And a word to the wise, if just randomly anybody tells you that they have a clone of exactly what you're looking for, do a little digging, be a little bit suspicious, but I actually knew this seller and had purchased from him before, and I knew he was really reputable. So when he said he had clones of the original to offer, my jaw dropped to the floor. Of course, it wasn't face to face. I was messaging him, but I was shocked. I almost could not believe it because I didn't really think that there were many clones in circulation at all. I thought you had to be like really somebody special to get your hands on a clone of this plant. And so I saved up my money. I bought one of his cuttings. I'd like to show you how it's doing now. If you're not new to the channel, you have seen this before. This is my King of Clarinervium clone. Let's bring it in a little bit closer so that you can appreciate it. And this is still a relatively young plant, so it doesn't fully have all the veins that you'll have seen in mother plant photos, which doubtless I've already put up on the screen by now. Look at what though I just saw as I was pulling it out of the cabinet for the sake of this video today. It is giving me its very first flower. So just to like reiterate the point that I've already beaten to death, I could self-pollinate this flower and get a whole bunch of offspring from this plant, but it would not be the same. It would not be this exact genetic thing that like specific traits, specific shape, it wouldn't all quite be the same. So I just thought I wanted to show you that after just a little bit of patience and maybe a little bit of luck finding somebody who had one, I was finally able to obtain the plant of my dreams, the wish list plant. Shortly thereafter, I was scrolling Instagram again, on Cartel's page again, because I really do love them. They've got a great selection of plants. I feel like I'm a commercial. Anyways, they had for sale a King of Clarinervium X Self that had mutated. Remember, I mentioned before that there are dominant and recessive genes, and that most of the time, if you were to self-pollinate this, you would get things that look kind of like it. But other times, randomly and much less often, you would get the weirdos and you would get the oddballs and recessive traits that are buried within the data of this plant. Recessive traits would come to the surface and you would get this. These two plants that I'm holding here are both versions of the same thing. This is the original King of Clarinervium that I obtained as a cutting from somebody who got a cutting. This was a result of the self-pollination of somebody's King of Clarinervium. So literally, this would have been the parent and this is the offspring. And I love that I have these two plants to show you today, because what better way to emphasize when you're buying a selfed seedling, you don't know what you'll get. Sometimes that can be pretty cool. And I love this plant. It is so weird and bizarre, and it just really stands out as a unique piece in my collection. I would never ever get rid of this thing. One of my top favorites, but you never know what you're gonna get when you self-pollinate an Anthurium. So I think that I can conclude my little informative video here, because I think I've said everything that I can say about the topic. I think it's important to know, if you are newer to the Anthurium hobby, or maybe you've been swimming around with us for a while and you feel like your plants don't look the way that they're supposed to, it could be because of this problem. Sometimes sellers are not always explicitly clear. Sometimes sellers are offering something and they don't really tell you that it is a selfed seedling. They'll just say, hey, I've got King of Clarinervium for sale. So I just want everybody to be aware. Be on the lookout. If you are after specific, unique traits, save your money and go for a clone. If you'd be satisfied with something that's along the same lines and probably very similar, then you can save quite a bit if you're able to find somebody's self-pollination seedling available. And also, self-pollination isn't bad. Like, I feel like I need to reiterate this, because if you're happy with the things similar, that's fine. There is no shame. Nobody's gonna look down on you. At least I'm not, because I think self-pollination is also the coolest thing ever, because it gives us these really weird, cool looking oddballs every now and again. So if you learned something today, comment below what you learned. I'm happy to offer as much as I know about this subject. If you have any further questions, leave them in the comments as well. And I will just have to wait and see you guys next time. Bye.